Q&A box below. So you can feel free to add comments or questions throughout. We'll be monitoring it, and for the last 15 minutes, we'll be pulling a Q&A from there to make sure that your questions get addressed. And you can also keep the conversation going after the webinar through social media. So Digital Principles handle is @DigiPrinciples, and you can also use the hashtag Digital Principles. I've also included each of the speakers' handles up here, so if you have any particular questions for them, feel free to tag them, reach out to them. Like I said, always happy to keep the conversation going since these are very pertinent to us. So, and we'll also make sure that we drop these handles in the chat so you can refer back to them as we move on in the conversation. So with that being said, I'm glad to finally kick off our first ever Pulse on the Principles webinar, From Dialogue to Action, Looking Inward for More Inclusive Digital Development. So we intended our kickoff webinar to be an overview of the principles and present a case study to allow people to kind of understand like what we do, what the principles are. However, the past few months have really reinforced unfortunate realities of racism and power dynamics, not just in the US in general, but really has made the international development community look inward and see how we ourselves are perpetuating racist or problematic actions, policies, procedures, even when most of us have gone into this field with the best of intentions. So, like the digital principles, it's really easy to endorse and say Black Lives Matter, but how are we as organizations and individuals living up to that statement? Do the digital principles themselves do an adequate job at uplifting marginalized communities and empowering our own teams? So this webinar is really an attempt to open up those uncomfortable conversations about our sector, our work, and about the digital principles themselves. Now, these topics are incredibly emotionally, mentally exhausting, so I'm really extending a special thanks to each one of our speakers for agreeing to open up about like their lived experiences and offering invaluable perspectives on what they've encountered in the field and where the digital principles and development community can do better. So I'm going to start off with a quick round of introductions. So each speaker, as I introduce you, just give a little bit of a wave so the audience knows who you are. So Dawn Seymour is the Senior Director of Programs and Operations at the Digital Impact Alliance. She has over 12 years of experience in global health and development. She spent the majority of her career living and working in African countries and has deep experience in the implementation of digital health solutions and change management strategies across health systems and organizations. Marissa Germain is the CEO and founder of Rido LLC, a social business dedicated to supporting development professionals. She's worked in international development for 8 years, working for a variety of donors, implementers, and foundations such as USAID, US State Department, Clinton Foundation, Inter-American Development Bank, and DFID. Angela Hungadi is the executive director at Ushahidi, a nonprofit tech company based in Nairobi, Kenya. She's a first-class honors graduate from Strathmore University and has experience as a software developer from 2010 to date. She's passionate about encouraging and empowering women to pursue careers in tech. And finally, Carolyn Flory is the Technology for Development Lead at the International Rice Research Institute in Los Baños, Philippines, where she focuses on leveraging digital agriculture technology for agricultural research for development. So before RRI, she worked at various organizations such as the United Nations Foundation, World Bank, USAID, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And she was also the former director for the collective impact team here at Dial and worked extensively on the digital principles. So we're really excited to have her here and get her experience on, or her insights on principles in general. So that said, we're gonna go ahead and get started with a very broad introduction from each of our panelists. And I'd like to open up by just kind of getting an idea of what got you interested in international development. sharing the types of barriers and challenges within organizations that you've worked at or partnered with that have intentionally or unintentionally resulted in racist or exclusionary policies, practices, or procedures. So I'm going to go ahead, stop sharing the screen here so that we can just get started. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over first to Miss Angela.
Thanks, Claudine. So mine's a little different because I come from a very heavy tech background, and now I'm working in the intersection of tech and international development, given the fact that the tools that we build are primarily used to amplify the work of those who are fighting for social justice and change. So for me, it's always been about, who and what the technology is in service of. Right. And, like you said, I'm really keen on the role of tech for the greater good and how it can help solve problems in our communities. Now, in the last 10 years of my career, I think it's been very clear that we have deep systemic issues that perpetuate discrimination pertaining to race and gender. And I'm just going to list a couple of examples. I'm sure the rest of the panel have their own, experiences. I think one of the first ones is, in the hiring policies, who gets the roles? And I think this stems from a perception that people who've studied outside of the continent have more knowledge and skill than local people. And that means that we value people who come from outside more than the locals, right? And then, even when you look at the constitution of the hiring committees, we tend to hire people that look like us or are similar to us. And, that way we're not really encouraging a much more diverse workforce. And then, that trickles down into, the kinds of organizational structures that exist in these organizations that have predominantly white males in positions of power decision-making. So you end up having a situation where the locals have no say and they have to do what they're told or, in essence, have to toe the line. And then that then stems much further into then looking at disparities in pay. It's not only compounded by the hiring practices, but also based on the role, right? You look at the locals being primarily implementers and not necessarily decision makers, right? And so you end up having the people in the global south earning much less than people in the global north, despite the fact that you might be doing the same kind of work. Or maybe even more, and the other person from the global north ends up getting better remuneration and better benefits than the local person. That might be a function of the markets that we're operating in, but in my opinion, honestly, if you're an organization that works in various areas, you consider yourself global, then I don't think that that's an excuse we really should be hiding behind. And sorry, did you catch that? Did I cut off at some point?
You cut off a little bit at the end. Can you just repeat that?
Yeah, so I think what I was saying is that, the disparities in pay might be a function of the markets that we're operating in. But in my opinion, I think that if you consider yourself a global organization, that honestly shouldn't be an excuse that you're hiding behind, that you should actually be playing a role in changing the status quo and, looking towards pay equity to some extent.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to then pass it on to Dawn to also share her experience, but also expand on what Angela said, because Dawn, you were born and raised in the US, but you spent so much of your career on the field. Can you talk a little bit about those trends that Angela talked about like local versus coming from outside, implementers, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of what Angela shared too really resonated with me and my experiences also. What really got me into this field in the first place is my background's in public health, and it's really decreasing disparities. So especially for my upbringing with having parents from very different backgrounds, I always observed and have experienced at a young age how different worlds can be if you're living in the same place, just based on the color of your skin, and often to gender, religion, sexuality, all these pieces. So that's certainly something, and I'm really appreciative of this conversation because it gets into some of those underlying contexts that we're seeing really come out in a more prevalent conversation. And what Angie mentioned has been my experience as well, and something that we really need to do better. Everything from the change that we're trying to see in the world, taking a look at if it's the teams that we develop, if it's the panels that we're on, how does this reflect the change that we're also trying to see? One of the key parts of the principles in designing with the user is having the conversation in the first place. So as we look at who's at the table, similar to what Angie mentioned too, of who has the decision-making power as well, is do those voices in that conversation actually reflect the communities that we're trying to serve? I think that's incredibly important. And then one of the things that we've been doing more intentionally as well is really understanding unconscious bias and how that does play out oftentimes in the way that people interview. So that's something that we've been considering as well. And I think another piece of my experience, and I'm going to be bold enough to say it, is also too just really confronting our own prejudice. There have been plenty of times where I have been a fly on the wall in certain conversations, and racist and prejudiced comments are made in our field. And so that's something too where we really have to, as individuals, confront our own prejudice, because that will certainly play out, whether intentionally or not, in a lot of the decisions that we make. And I think some of the ways to go about that is just being very aware of it, and also being intentional about what we need to do better as a sector, but also what we need to do better as individuals.
Thank you, Dawn. And then I'm going to pass that to Marissa to also continue to like build on what like Angela and Dawn said, just because you've worked, within in field with donors. Can you talk about like the sort of like practices or problematic trends that you've noticed as well?
So I find a lot of this conversation extremely helpful because we are all well-intentioned individuals who are trying to make the world a better place. You wouldn't be in development if you didn't have that drive or that desire, because there are more lucrative ways to impact the world in a different way. But it's been interesting to see how donors have structured their involvement in the developing world, for the lack of a better term, as they have tried to really build relationships and build community connections. It's often done in a way that it is putting the donor's needs and the donor's reputation first, not always what is best for the community. In a lot of ways, we understand that because that comes as part of a larger apparatus. It's not, a rich, wealthy individual who just out of the goodness of their heart wants to help a particular country. There's usually an agenda and overarching themes that are trying to be addressed. And so as an individual within that larger apparatus, it can be very challenging to navigate that relationship of wanting to help the donor reach their intended agenda and their intended goals, while also acknowledging the disconnect with the agenda and what is needed in the field. In my experiences, for example, there was a question about how do we design certain programs so that we could meet economic development outcomes, but things that were desperately needed in the country, like infrastructure, because they need roads, they need processing facilities, were out of the question. And those were the real linchpins and the real keys to enable the economy to grow. And by having those kinds of barriers to be able to achieve the intended outcome, it really hems in and really neuters the ability to achieve the goal. And then persists this weird involvement in these countries and doesn't really help us get to the ultimate outcome and the ultimate goal of working ourselves out of a job in these countries.
Thank you, Marissa. And then finally, Miss Carolyn, you recently, you were at Dial and then you moved over to the Philippines. Can you talk a little bit about like what that transition has been like? Any particular things that you have noticed about the way countries or organizations in the US might be treated differently from donor organizations versus the one that you're working at now?
Sure. So I think that it's, having shifted from working in Washington, D.C. for 12 years to working in the Philippines for the past 2.5 years has been really eye-opening. And it's been eye-opening in the sense of trying to, as a steward of the Principles for Digital Development, as an international development professional, understanding how that translates in other places. And also I'm at a different type of organization in terms of agricultural research. And so I think that it's really humbled me a lot to recognize that the structures that exist in Washington, D.C. are not reflected. And especially, I think, and we were talking about this earlier in terms of the presence of Southeast Asia in a lot of the conversation. So like, obviously, no offense to you guys, because I love you guys, but like right now it's 11:16 p.m. And so you have a lot of these types of webinars that are, we don't have a chance to actively participate in. And I think that some organizations are trying to address those, but having that frame of inclusivity and saying, how can we make sure that we're getting voices from around the entire globe? And just to sort of build on some of what my colleagues have said, some of the other panelists, I think one of the, as I was thinking about it, one thing that isn't as like front and center, and living in the Philippines at this time when the conversation in the US is it's like so incredibly needed right now. I've been really hungry for this type of conversation. One of the things that I found in Washington, D.C. is like Marissa was saying, a lot of people, they get into development because they think of themselves as good people. They want to do good in the world. And I think that actually can be a barrier to having really honest conversations with people who consider themselves allies, who say, I'm a nice person, I'm doing good in the world. Like how, I think there's a real defensiveness that's built up, and also a wall to say, but can we talk about white supremacy? Can we talk about anti-racism and have those honest conversations? It's not an attack. It's a chance to talk more about that and how that actually impacts the work that you're doing in around the world. So I think that's just like an added piece that I don't see as much of necessarily in the Philippines, but I think it's there, and so would love to explore that as well.
Thank you, Carolyn. And just for the speakers, like feel free to jump in, make comments about from what each of your fellow panelists have said, but then just building off of like what all of you guys have said, we tend to unintentionally go into this work with sort of a savior mentality, right? Like Angela said, like we go in thinking like we know best because for whatever reason. So maybe Angela, you can kind of kick off the conversation. The rest of you guys can feel free to jump in, but can you take us a little bit through like, how often do you see actual community-driven development versus donor development, and why don't we seem to trust local leaders to bring our work forward? And I know that's a big question, so feel free to riff on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, to be honest, and I think it's a challenge that we're also trying to think about as a Shahidi, as we try and think about the best ways of actually enabling the social change we want to see in the world. More often than not, I think this was said by one of the panelists, the agenda is being set from somewhere else, right? It's not necessarily being set by the local people based on the problems that they're experiencing. And I think it all stems from how we've been conditioned, right? And it also goes to show how deeply rooted some of this, prejudices are in our society. The perception that's been created of the global South is one riddled with poverty, corruption, bad governance, poor education. And so the concept of having one well-educated people or professionals coming out of this situation is quite jarring for many. Or the concept that, you might have a couple of people who might be able to clearly understand what's going on and also think about some of the tactics to employ to solve a problem is still, a concept that is new for many people. And honestly, it feels like there's a lack of trust in the ability of those who are directly affected to actually solve problems of their own, with some support. And I think, it's why, in as much as you have all of these development programs being set to benefit the underserved, the requirements and conditions attached to funding organizations working in this space are quite honestly quite atrocious, right? The level of scrutiny that a local organization will go through must in due diligence processes is quite crazy, because it feels like we don't trust in them being able to manage the resources that are given to them to actually solve the problem, right? And the other thing as well is that unfortunately funders trust people who look like them. And so we also have to ask ourselves the question of where's the aid coming from, right? Primarily it's from the global north coming down to the global south. And one other uncomfortable fact that we also need to be, just need to acknowledge is the fact that a lot of the problems that are being faced in the global south stem from colonialism, right, caused by the global north. And it's until we start acknowledging where the root of the problem actually came from, then it's going to be very difficult for us to make progress.
And I'm going to build on that. There is a lack of trust between donors and the global south and locally based organizations. And often I believe that comes from the history of government funds disappearing. My familial experience has been in Haiti, where we were talking about it this week. Every president has left the country with millions of dollars from the treasury. So it's when there is fragile governance within a country, there is almost a justification for donors to hold back their trust and their willingness to work with local organizations, but that really impedes the ability of good, strong local organizations to really be able to take a leadership role and take responsibility and be able to lead the conversation. So while that has been the history, I believe that there should be a better or a revisioning of how we interact with local organizations and find ways to build the trust so donors can more comfortably engage with local organizations and not fear that, oh, well, this EO is just going to run off to the Maldives and we'll never see our $1 million investment again.
So where do you guys kind of see US-based NGOs sort of falling into that? Because in some ways we're sort of like that middle person between the donors working with the locals. So how do we just be better advocates for our local partners?
I can take a stab at that. I think when you said middle person, I was like, how do we stop being enablers, right, of continuing these same behaviors? And I think part of that, and part of what Angie mentioned, so even in my time being based or working and living in other countries, is really broadening our circle. I think oftentimes, and to just highlight that point, we have a habit of going to the same people over and over, and then it gets into those underpinnings of mistrust and other pieces. I think another part that from my experience has been a challenge too, is the projection, I'll specifically say, of American culture onto other countries. So that when something is implemented or something is done, it has to be by the books of how it would be done in the United States, which totally, leaves out any cultural context, leaves out important voices from people in the communities, leaves out the important voices of the people who are actually working with those receiving these different types of interventions on a day-to-day basis. So I think part of that, to stop being an enabler, I'm just going to use that word, is to really continue to look out at different organizations and get out of our comfort zone. That was one thing that came out to me of what people said: be comfortable with being uncomfortable, actually go out and look. And I think Angie brought up another great piece too, is just the due diligence process for in-country organizations. Even though we say that that's what we want to promote, that's what we want to do, we really have to revisit the policies that cause that challenge in the first place. So then if that's the process you have to follow, how do you already thinking about it say, well, I know that's going to be a lot of work, maybe I'll just take the easy route, and then it continues to perpetuate that problem.
I think it goes back a little further too, and going back to the principles and thinking about things like understand the existing ecosystem, design with the user, right? I mean, the language that we use in terms of, capacity development and buy-in, local ownership, those exist because those conversations aren't happening from the very beginning, right? You don't have to focus on the local ownership if this was a co-created, actually designed, co-designed with organizations that are in country. And so I think we have to take so many more steps back as we think about this issue. And I think on an individual level, for me, it's thinking about the organizations that I've worked with and how many of them have staff in country, and how many of those country offices, like Angie was saying, actually have equitable staffing or resources, pay, salaries, et cetera, and how many of those are actually people who are from the geographies that they're placed in. I think that those are some of the key questions that we have to ask ourselves as well. How many times have you gone on you've taken on a new project, or someone's taken on a new project, and you just sort of parachute into a country that you have no history in terms of like the colonial history, the economic history, and anthropological. I mean, just so many layers that I think that we just sort of assume we'll figure it out. This country's close to that country. It's a former colony of this country, and so I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that our organizations and ourselves are doing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'd like to take this moment to put our foot in the door, like talking a little bit more about the digital principles or other sort of like standards in the development sector that we hold ourselves up to. So as like Dawn and Carolyn have mentioned, we have design with user, we have understand the existing ecosystem to sort of start to open up those conversations. But is that sufficient just to talk about it? Do we need to be, principles are principles are principles. Like you can change the wording, but at the end of the day, how are we actually holding organizations that sign on to this accountable for that? Is it more resources? Is it more tools? Like, what do we need to be doing? And are the principles like actually adequate in addressing these sort of inequalities?
I'll take a stab at that. I think that's the challenge of our industry, is that we have these very high ideals and high values, but the reality is if you try to hold your more senior colleague accountable, the possibility of blowback and retaliation and missing out on a promotion, getting stuck on really bad projects, and never really feeling fulfilled in your work is very high, and it is forcing people to not say anything. So even if there are values and mission statements and we all sign them and we're all there taking pictures together and we're here to like commit to social justice, there's not really an external voice or place to really have conversations and voice concerns and then look for tools and resources. Usually people just, well, this place is not really working for me, so I'm going to move on to the next organization and maybe it'll get better there. And so you can see like in all of our CVs, it's incredibly rare to see anyone at an organization for longer than 5 years, because you're moving around constantly and trying to find opportunities. Sometimes it is due to the fact that a project ends, but sometimes it is because, what, I can't grow in this organization. I'm not going to hold them accountable for their ability to fulfill their mission. And I'm just going to go someplace else, get what I need and move on.
Yeah, maybe I could just chime in there a little bit as well. So just looking at the principles are there, design with the user, understanding the existing ecosystem. I think the conversation is to move away from what exactly the principles stand for into exactly how to operationalize it, right? So, looking at it from your individual organization's perspective, what exactly does it mean to design with the user? What are some of the policies that need to change, right? Does it mean that before we set different project goals, that we have conversations with the beneficiaries, have some of those focus group discussions to figure out if this actually is fitting out really well? When you're talking about understanding the ecosystem, what's a process that your team needs to go through before actually going onto the ground to actually start implementation, right? Thinking at like building for sustainability. What are some of the processes that you have in place to hand over the project to the local people so that they're actually able to carry on the vision of the project? So I think we need to move away from what the principles stand for, because I think it's quite clear and it's very easy for us to come in and say, yes, we believe in it, but then the challenge then comes into, how does this actually get operationalized? What are the changes that need to happen at an organizational level, whether it's in terms of the people that we hire or some of the activities that we run, right? And maybe that's where the resources need to get channeled towards.
Yeah. I mean, so like I said, I think it was a really great opportunity moving to the Philippines and being like, okay, the principles are a great frame. So I have a document, a website I can point to say like, these are international principles, people are doing these, here they are. But at the same time, I think that we have to recognize that they were created by people in Washington, D.C. and London. They were not necessarily created in Los Baños and Nairobi and Dakar and Haiti, right? Like, So I think that we do have to take a step back there too, and recognize that, appreciate it. And if they are living principles, how do we ensure that they are living? How do we make sure that we can iterate upon them and integrate more people now that we recognize that they weren't necessarily created by the most representative group of people? How can we change that? How can we involve more voices? I think that's the role that this community is really playing, and it's a great opportunity now, I think, too, as you're reinvigorating them as well. But as I've been out here, I've already had some conversations with other colleagues who are coming from Washington, D.C., and now they're in other countries, and they're like, man, it's hard to implement the principles. It's hard to say, like, okay, I'm going to go through all 9 of them and check everything off the list. So I think we also have to be a little bit easy on ourselves as well, and say that there are trade-offs, and we're going to do the best that we can and spread the word about what these sort of best practices are. But yeah, I don't know, give ourselves a little bit of a break as well sometimes.
Yeah, you bring up a good point that, principles were created by the very power structures that are currently in place, and they're telling us how to do development. So, we've gotten a lot of questions about, do the principles aid in inclusivity? And I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that, like, kind of not, right? So does that mean, as we look to revamp the principles, is it more about like adding an inclusion principle, not being blind, like, being a little bit more explicit in acknowledging like race and gender, or is it about making sure it's more interwoven into like the operations of how we apply the principles? Anyone can answer that.
I think it needs to be more interwoven, right? And I wouldn't want, that's my fear with the conversations that are happening now, is it's going to become a checkbox. Like, I feel like gender has become sort of a checkbox, or monitoring and evaluation is a checkbox. Like, have you done this? Yes, there's one woman on, that we surveyed. That's great. So I do, I think it's deeper than that. It's something that should be cross-cutting through all of the principles. There should be focuses on inclusion and not just, diversity. But I think organizations have to do some real inward looking in terms of the projects that they currently have as well, and how they're potentially not perpetuating, how they're not promoting inclusion in their current projects. I think that that's sort of a starting point, and that's a conversation that you guys can also foster.
Yeah, and a little bit of how I heard that too, Carolyn. For context, within the UN Foundation, we've had a lot of conversations recently about systemic racism here in the United States. And part of the interesting thing with that conversation is we often look at what are we doing in the future without really understanding the past and how we got there in the first place. And so one thing I just wanted to say, I appreciate how I interpreted what you said, is really revisiting and taking a look at how this has all come about in the first place, and how understanding those behaviors, unconscious bias, a variety of things, how can we look at changing that as individuals, and what does that mean for organizations? Because it's always helpful to look forward, but if we really don't dig into the nasty roots and weeds of like where this all came from in the first place, then we're at risk of missing it. And I think from my experience, that's where it would probably feel more of a, checkbox, got it, without really fixing the underlying problems.
And I think you also touch on like a great point that, it's about questioning our unconscious bias, asking, why are we doing things the way that we're doing? So question for all of you is, myself, I'm a junior staff at Dial, and, I can donate, I can protest, I can do my best in my work. At the end of the day, I don't have the same kind of influence in like hiring practices or have a lot of say of like how things are done. So how can people at their organizations in their respective role, being conscious of those power dynamics, make sure that, these inequalities are not being perpetuated?
I think when we last spoke about, like, you've mentioned a couple of different things, right? You've mentioned making donations, you've mentioned speaking up about, some of the injustice being perpetuated. I think that in itself is already powerful, and I'd encourage anybody who feels safe enough to do that to go ahead and do so. But I actually think that the responsibility falls even more squarely on the shoulders of those in leadership positions to create that space where you feel safe enough to speak up, to share your opinions, to, you know, lobby for change without fear of retribution. Because the unfortunate thing is, and I think this is something that was mentioned a little earlier in the discussion, that, you know, most of the time you'll speak up and, you know, you'll get punished for it. You're either dumped with a bad project, or, you know, you don't rise up the ranks, or things like that. So I actually feel like it's, well, there's an element of, yes, as a junior staff, make sure that you are, you know, not keeping quiet and being brave enough to speak up, but that the person on the other end is actually listening to you and doing something about it. And a function of that is making sure that you have a safe space to do that and clear, actionable points.
So we kind of talked a lot about this in our Redo conversations. How do we as individuals, whether we're consultants, we're junior staff, senior staff, how do I do this as an individual? And to echo Angela, if you're feeling safe and you're already contributing in a lot of ways, like going to the protest, donating money, asking questions, asking questions is always a safe way to open another person to answering the question and to consider obtaining new information to answer the question. If you are not feeling comfortable holding your organization accountable, because I think we also need to be sensitive to when you're a junior staff person, if you're blowing through the doors and you're like, everything needs to change, just like everything everyone has done for the past 50 years is garbage, we're starting over, like it's not respectful and it's not always well received. So asking questions, and to Dawn's point, understanding the history of things and continuing to nudge the conversation forward so that you can obtain new information about why things are the way they are and identify what are the realistic changes that can take place within your organization is really important. And that there are so many ways to participate in dismantling of white supremacy culture. Sometimes it's individual learning, sometimes it's coaching a friend who gets it but doesn't exactly get it, and just needs to be able to talk it out. So yeah, we just have to be comfortable in finding our lane and then continuing to invest in that lane and keeping an eye on where they can go forward.
Yeah, and I just want to plus one and applaud Angela too for bringing up the safe environment piece. I think that is critical. So anytime, if it's in the daily work that we're doing, if it's being more intentional about how we want to change the way that we operate, recruit, any of these aspects, it has to be a safe and open environment to be willing to help individuals understand that for what they say, it will be heard and that it will be acted upon. Because I think oftentimes from my experience, if I say something and I don't see that change, then yeah, I'm going to be more and more likely to just stay closed up. And then how does that not speaking up also continue to perpetuate the problem? So I just wanted to applaud that. I think that's a massive part of this, is that safe environment, and acknowledge that sometimes it can be confronting for individuals because it's getting, comfortable with being uncomfortable, because it might be their own behavior that is causing the problem as well. But definitely wanted to applaud that.
I think the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about too is my own actions and where I have been guilty in taking advantage of the fact that I'm an American woman, or, the privilege that brings, or a lot of other layers of privilege as well. And so thinking about my own behavior and how that needs to change moving forward too, because it's on that, I feel like a lot of what I can do now living so far away is on that individual level, and sort of to what you're saying as well, Claude, right? In terms of supporting the movements as best as you can. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think Marissa, the Redo, your Redo has been leading a lot of the conversation about just compassion and safe spaces. I think right now it's a really difficult place to be in as a Black woman, as a person of color, just because you're trying to take care of yourself while you're taking care of other people. So I don't know, can you just expand on those conversations a little bit more?
Yes, so a lot happened in them. And basically what kind of came out of a lot of this conversation is that for BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, that community. There is a lot of history, trauma, experiences that are involved. And to ask that group to lead the conversation on how to dismantle racism within international development is a huge ask, because already we're doing very involved work. We're exposing ourselves to the traumas of the world and trying to solve them, in addition to dealing with our individual traumas, in addition to solving our organization's traumas. So within our larger organizations, allyship really needs to step up and really apply that lens of understanding and compassion that your colleagues, even if you haven't had the conversation with them, may or may not be really struggling in this period of time to see what's happening in their home countries, is reminding them of what's happening. Like what's happening here in the US reminds them of the trauma they experienced in another place. And it's a lot. So yeah, I mean, and on the ally end, there's a lot of individuals who are interested in wanting to help and wanting to find ways to look at themselves in the mirror, identify the different privileges and the ways in their behavior has perpetuated this whole system. And really, we're kind of at a place now where we need to think of ways to come together and think of ways to develop safe conversations. And whether that's like the BIPOC group can have a safe space together, and Black individuals can have a safe space to have specific Black conversations and come up with recommendations, things that they've observed as a collective. So there's anonymity, there's safety there. And to Dawn's point, allies to be willing to listen, to be uncomfortable and acknowledge that the work that they've done is not always appropriate, or that there are things that need to change. Having that openness and that awareness is what is going to be needed. And yes, because like the conversations like went over everything from like individual trauma to like my organization is this, and oh, the whole system is huge and we don't know how to fix it. And we're just all kind of experiencing all of these things all the time, which is a lot. And there are things that all of us can do. We just need to maybe take this weekend to take a deep breath, do some deep breathing and deep thinking about how is it that we want to show up in this field. Because I personally have struggled with that a lot, is, when I'm deployed in another country and I've taken on a role that I'm like fairly certain someone in the country could do as well, but I'm getting danger pay, I'm getting my hotel benefit, or I'm not delivering to the same level as some of the peers that are in the room, and I am choosing to use my space as opposed to giving them a space at the table and the opportunity to speak. These are all things that we need to be aware of, and things that we need to be constantly reflecting on and constantly asking ourselves, because this isn't going to end at the end of the summer when everyone goes on to the next issue of climate change or poverty or homelessness. Like institutional racism is going to be an issue until we are able to truly dismantle it in all of our major institutions and have accountability for ourselves and our organizations. So while we work through that, we need to work together. We need to also give ourselves space, but also find ways to be able to nudge the conversation forward in ways that we feel safe, and also not give ourselves a hard time that we're not at the front lines of the protest, because there'll be another one in 6 months. So take a break. We need like the different waves of activists along the way. So take care of yourself first and identify what it is that you have that you can leverage to moving this conversation forward. And sometimes it's becoming best friends with the person who clearly is being ostracized by your organization.
Thank you, Marissa. So I'm just going to take 1 minute before we hop into the quick Q&A to say, thank you guys, so much. And I think also a good place, to start and to see where like a lot of these practices are perpetuators, like even like at our own conferences. And I know that's been like a point of conversation a lot. Like you go to these conferences, like who can actually afford to go there, who is actually given the chance to speak. And, we might hold it in Uganda, but our local Ugandans actually like involved in these conversations. So how do we start to be more inclusive in that way? So that said, it is 11:45 on the dot here in DC. So I'm going to open up with some Q&A questions that we got in our RSVP form. So how are your guys' organizations evaluating, or how could they evaluate gender or racial equality? Which ones are worthwhile, are they feasible to track, and what are some valuable metrics?
I can start. For the Digital Impact Alliance, we've had a specific lens for gender equity. We're really broadening that into leave no one behind. So how does that cover a variety of different aspects of demographics of individuals? And so one is being more intentional by having someone who is focusing on that specifically, because I think that's a big part of it. A little bit of what Marissa shared. It's like, we want to be able to cover so many things because we're passionate about it. What I have found from my experience to be most successful is who is that person who's actually waking up and thinking about this each day, but how are we also having aspects of that for our responsibility? Some of that too, and Angela highlighted it, is getting really reevaluating our hiring practices. So some aspects of that could even be blocking out the names, right? Because unconscious bias, people will look at names and make certain assumptions if it's gender, race, other pieces. So those are a few of the steps that we're taking. And also too, more recently with Black Lives Matter here in the United States, is being more intentional about how we create the space for the conversation and take certain actions that we feel a little bit, what Marissa was saying, there's so much that we can do, but finding the maybe few things that we can do really well and being very intentional about it. And one other that I'll say for my the team that I manage as well has been the most impacted by a lot of what's happened more recently in the United States. So I'd say any of us who are in a supervisor role as well is to be very intentional about giving those individuals time to take a mental health day, because it is very impactful. So those are a few ways that we're talking about it from an organizational level. What does that mean for those of us in leadership roles? And also too, how are we being very intentional about how we protect and honor our team members who are having a really tough time?
Yeah, if I could dive in a little bit deeper, especially on the aspect of some of the hiring policies. One of the things that we're trying to do much better of now is, when we're talking about creating a diverse and an inclusive team, it also stems from, the pipeline, the hiring pipeline. So, in cases where we're not seeing a diverse list of candidates, and, have we gone a little bit further, whether it's going into women in tech groups or, different, places where some of those, Black and Indigenous people of color will be, whether it's Slack channels or different communities in different parts of the world, just so that you're making sure that the pipeline of people who are coming in is inclusive, and that you have no excuse at the end of it all to say, hey, I didn't hire because they didn't come through the pipeline, right? But a thing that I'm struggling with, and I think I brought this up when we were having a discussion before, is so in terms of metrics and ways of trying to measure inclusivity, I mean, you can have some of those metrics, like figuring out the number of women you've had, the number of Black people you have in your team, which is a function of, there's this quote that comes to mind, that diversity is being invited to the party. And it seems like we're doing well with that, right? But then you look at the second part of it, which is that inclusion is being asked to dance. And the thing that I'm having trouble with is, how do we measure when that internalized or that unconscious bias doesn't exist anymore? Right? That in as much as you have met your quota, of the number of people you need to hire, that there isn't somebody at the back of their mind thinking that, oh, they got it not because they earned it, but because it's affirmative action, right? And so that's the thing that's still weighing on my mind. Like, how do we measure that?
I mean, you can pretty much go to any country that we're working in, and you will definitely find those individuals. So they're like, oh, well, we found this one brown person. He's local. He can totally handle this particular piece. And you're like, oh my God, he has no experience, and he can't write a sentence in English to save his life. And I have to rewrite this entire report 7 times so that we can submit it for the donor. And these, I think, where the lens we need to apply is that we're not going to achieve utopia, right? Like, we're not going to end up in a place where everyone that we're including is going to be the best person. There's going to be naturally some people who don't need to be there and are bad actors. But I think in my experiences, when I engage in hiring practices, I try to build as much time for recruiting as possible and try to ask for as many references or referrals as possible to make sure that I find someone who's strong in their qualifications, and also it has a deeper understanding of the context than just, the first person I found on the side of the street. So I think it's going to be imperfect. We're going to need practice, we're going to make mistakes, but it's from those mistakes and it's from that practice that we will refine a better process and a better system. And that's the greatest way to grow and learn.
And I think some of the other sort of even getting into the details of what is the language that you're using in a job description, right? What types of experience are you requiring, or level of education are being required, all the way down to it. In our previous conversation, we had spoken about paid internships. So thinking about who, what experience is valued, and if your organization is committed to making sure that there is equity and inclusion, pay all of your interns, right? Like make sure that everyone has an opportunity to live in expensive cities like Washington, D.C. and can work for, don't expect them to work for free, because that's not everyone, and that's not inclusive. So I think even going down to thinking about, where are you going to get those candidates from, and making sure that's inclusive from the very beginning.
Yeah, and you guys all hit on like really great points, like the difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity is more that checkbox. How are we making sure that the people people of color or other sorts of, different communities that we're including, how do we make sure like their opinions and concerns are actually integrated into the work that we're doing? That is true inclusion. And I think that's what, we should be really measuring by, not just like how many people of color do we have on our team. That's insufficient. And then Carolyn, you brought up the great point about like hiring, who can actually afford to live unpaid in like, the UN in like Geneva or Washington, D.C. And I do think internships are really, where careers, that's where they start. That kind of determines your trajectory for like the rest of your career. So just making sure like we're not only recruiting from like the Georgetown or American University, love them, but they are given so many opportunities, like especially here in DC. So just being more mindful of those things. So we do have one question, a couple more questions actually. So quickly, can all of you tell about a specific time where you successfully tackle discrimination? And do you have any specific pointers on how to confront such issues? And just letting you know, we have like less than 10 minutes left before we wrap it up.
One tiny example, I was mic running at an event, and it was a predominantly white male group, and I made sure that I handed the mic to women and people of color first, and if none of them were raising their hand, then I would move on to those who were in the rest of the group. So I think like you got to find little tiny ways to tackle it on, and then you get practice in being able to do it in bigger ways.
Yeah, and it's even like I was on a hiring panel, and I had to point out to the group that the entire hiring panel was the same. We're all men from the same country, hiring only candidates that were all men from the same. I mean, it was just like hiring like. So even pointing out like, hey guys, I'm the, something, one of these things is not like the other. Why is that happening? And honestly, my colleagues had no idea. Like they were just like kind of clueless that was even a problem. So even pointing out, like Marissa's saying, like trying to make some of those small differences.
One of mine, especially, I think I'll say growing up in the United States and being in different cultures, one of mine for discrimination is to just keep my mouth shut and listen, because one of the things that I noticed when individuals would drop in from the United States, oftentimes people would look to me in group conversations for an answer, like, oh, there's another American room. Let me ask this person. But it's like, I don't have all the cultural context. I've only been here, a couple of years, and that's still scratching the surface. So I think one of the things too that's really helpful, and I hear it in the examples of Marissa, Carolyn, it gets back into the digital principles as well, is the conversation and whose voice is being heard, but also making sure that I'll say that was one of my big lessons learned, especially with American culture, because I think we tend to overtalk a lot, is to be quiet and let others make sure that they have their voices heard as well. And that takes a very intentional mindset and shift to do, I'd say.
Yeah, I think my examples resonate. They're very similar, so in cases where, because, we have a very diverse team, and, as Kenyans naturally, I don't perpetuate a stereotype, but even for myself, I wasn't someone who'd be very vocal at times. Like if you're in a group of people who are talking too much, then I'll default to being quiet. And, over time I had to learn how to speak up. But then in cases where I'd notice the rest of my team not speaking up, then I'll make sure that if I'm directing a conversation, then I point at a specific person and ask them to speak, so the voice doesn't get, muddled down. Or looking at some of our hiring practices. So looking at, maybe the last 5 hires, were they predominantly people from the global north, and what that problem then points to, and having a tough conversation about the fact that we need to have a development team that actually looks like a global organization. So those would be the examples that I'd give.
Thank you, everyone. So we got about 4 minutes left. One final wrap-up question. I would love to hear everyone's elevator pitch on how do we keep the momentum going? Any specific call to action for organizations or individuals who are joining or listening in today?
I would say there's 2 messages here. If you are a Black, Indigenous, person of color, or of the local staff, if you need a break, take a break. Take a day off, rest. If you are up for it, then jump on in and start holding your organization accountable. Find some allies, because there's probably at least one. And if that organization is not really working for you, don't be afraid to move on to another one. In some of the groups that I follow, there's been a really interesting disruption of organizations where very racist leaders are being removed, or they're being called out on social media. And if you're in that work environment, you don't have to stay. You don't owe it to the people that you're serving to stay in a really bad work environment if you don't have the strength to challenge it and make it better. So that is my small call to action. And if you can participate in improving your organization, then by all means, please do it. But don't do it at your expense, because there are other places that can benefit from your gifts.
Yeah. I think for me, looking at it from the lens of somebody who's leading an organization, I think the call to action there would be, as leaders in this space, be comfortable in this uncomfortable space. It's really necessary to have this conversation. So it doesn't do you any good by hiding and not having very honest conversations. If you don't feel like you're equipped to have it, then get a professional to help you actually have that conversation, so you can then lead to actual change.
So for me, I think it's, and Claude and I were talking about this a little before, like kind of doing some inward looking as well, and not feeling like, okay, I gotta talk to them, find all my Black friends, talk to them about how are you feeling, how are you doing, but really, think about your own actions and what you can do. Read some books, educate yourself, take some time to understand how you can help dismantle white supremacy and be actively anti-racist in your organizations. And I think it is, I feel like I'm sort of at the stage in my career where I'm a bit more like, let's just be uncomfortable. I'm not going to apologize for you being uncomfortable. I'm not going to take your excuses for intentionality or unintentionality. We're going to have these conversations, but that's not true for everyone, right? So find ways that you can make those small changes. I'm very supportive of what Marissa said. If you are not happy and you are uncomfortable, like you owe it to yourself to not be in that situation.
Ooh, and shameless plug, you can follow Rito on Instagram, and we have a LinkedIn page. We are going to be doing a 4-week session, these conversations about compassion fatigue, because coming off of the tale of talking about race and white supremacist culture and what this all means, there's going to be some compassion fatigue that's totally playing into your ability to carry this conversation forward. So they're not recorded, so they're an informal gathering space. So find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, or message me on Twitter.
I've been in those conversations, and I can also vouch that they're phenomenal safe spaces. Okay, so Don?
Yeah, the one thing I was going to add is, and it touches on what each of the panelists said as well, is really ask yourself, why now? I think the thing I've struggled with is kind of like, well, why now? Like, we've been talking about this for centuries, like, why now? But also really being supportive of individuals who are like, it's now. Like, I feel galvanized to do something. And so by understanding that, really listening to what that passion and that fire is, because then that, to Marissa's point, is going to help you with that momentum. What does that mean in terms of sustaining? Who are your allies that are going to help you through it? Who are your friends who are going to help you through it? So I think really listening to what is it that's different about this time. And that's the thing you hold on to keep that passion, to keep driving for change, even if it's something a little bit each day, even if it's something over time, to make sure you're doing your self-care, but know that each step and the fact that you feel it now is part of what's going to help us change this together.
Thank you, Dawn. That was beautiful. And I think that actually ended on a really good note. We're at 12 p.m. and just, change is incremental. These conversations, recommended reading, that's barely the start of it. So hopefully you guys continue to engage with us on social media on how your organizations can do better, how digital principles can do better. But other than that, thank you one more time to all our speakers for, sharing today. And yeah, see you guys on the interwebs. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.